Vivian Marsh was 41 years old, and for 6 years she had been watching her husband the way a structural engineer watches a bridge. Not with suspicion, exactly, but with the trained understanding that every load-bearing thing eventually reveals, under the right conditions, exactly how sound it was built. She wore her work clothes to church on the Sundays they went together, and carried a second-hand purse she had owned for 11 years, and drove a 12-year-old Buick LeSabre with a check engine light she had learned, through careful diagnosis, to ignore. His family called her Quiet Vivian, and considered this a polite way of saying she was not much. Her husband, Raymond, let them say it, because agreeing with his family had always been easier than examining why their opinions required his agreement. To anyone watching, she was a softly spoken woman of modest circumstances, the wife of Raymond Marsh, who sold commercial vac systems across the greater Atlanta metro and drove a leased Tahoe and had opinions about things he had not personally studied. What Raymond had never thought to ask, not in 6 years of marriage, was what Vivian did between 9 in the morning and 6 in the evening on the days she drove to her office on Peachtree Industrial Boulevard and came home with quiet hands and no particular stories. The test had been running for 4 months before the evening he came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table with the monthly account statement open between them and the words she had chosen with great care and deliberate precision. She told him they were in financial trouble. She told him the consulting business had failed. She told him the number, $62,000 in debt, the savings gone, the business account at zero. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he raised his hand and brought it down across her face. He had no idea she had known he would. He had no idea what she had already built to be ready when he did. What Raymond Marsh lost in the months that followed was not just a marriage. It was every credential, every asset, and every story he had ever told about the kind of man he was. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from. And subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light came in through the east windows of Vivian's home office and landed on the drafting table she had assembled herself from reclaimed oak planks she had sourced from a salvage yard in Decatur and carried home in the back of the Buick over 2 Saturday trips. She had planed the surface smooth, fitted the legs with steel hairpin brackets she ordered from a craftsman in Chattanooga, and finished the whole thing with 2 coats of Danish oil applied by hand on a Sunday when Raymond was watching a game in the other room and had no interest in what she was doing. She sat at that table every morning at 6:15 with her coffee and her legal pad before the house fully woke, and this was the hour that belonged entirely to her. She was a forensic document examiner. She had built her practice over 9 years, beginning as a certified examiner for the Fulton County court system and expanding, steadily and without announcement, into private consulting work for law firms, insurance companies, and 2 federal agencies whose names she did not mention casually. She examined disputed signatures, altered contracts, forged wills, fraudulent loan documents. She spent her professional life reading the things people had tried to make unreadable, and she was very good at it. Her father, Leonard Marsh, no relation to the man she had married, a coincidence that had once seemed like a sign and later seemed like the universe's sense of irony, had been a handwriting analyst for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation for 27 years before his retirement. He was 73 now and lived 40 minutes north in Roswell, and he had taught her to read a document the way other fathers taught their children to read a room, starting at the edges, working toward the center, trusting the details that seemed too small to matter. He used to say, "A forgery is always in a hurry. Authenticity never is. The difference is in where the pen slows down." She had applied this to documents for 20 years. Over the past 4 months, she had applied it to a marriage. She had met Raymond at a mutual friend's dinner party in Buckhead, 7 years before the evening at the kitchen table. He was charming in the way of men who had learned early that charm was more efficient than effort. Quick with a compliment, easy with a laugh, attentive in the particular way that functions as performance rather than presence. She had noted this at the time and chosen, as people sometimes do, to believe the performance was the beginning of something real. The early years were not unhappy. She ran her practice. He ran his sales territory. They kept separate finances at her insistence, and a joint account for household expenses at his, and for a while, the arrangement was unremarkable. She noticed the first irregularity in the third year, a pattern of small withdrawals from the joint account on Friday evenings, always cash, always between $200 and $400, always followed by receipts that did not quite correspond to anything she could identify. She had noted it. She had not yet acted on it. The second irregularity arrived in year 4, in the form of a business card she found inside the pocket of his dry cleaning, a card for a woman named Tanya Birch, sales director at a competing vac firm, with a handwritten note on the back in penmanship Vivian could have identified as belonging to Raymond at 50 yards. She had examined enough authentic signatures in her career to know the difference between a hand that was careful and a hand that was comfortable. Raymond's note was comfortable. It was written by a man who had not considered, even briefly, who else might read it. She had placed the card in a small fireproof lockbox she kept inside the bottom drawer of the salvage oak drafting table. Beneath a false bottom she had fitted herself from a 1/4 inch of birch plywood, stained to match. That lockbox was the detail that would matter later. Raymond had lived in this house for 5 years and had moved through it every day, and he had never once noticed the false bottom, because noticing it would have required him to look at something that was not about him. He never had. The test was not a decision she made impulsively. It was a decision she made the way she made all significant decisions, after documentation, after cross-referencing, after she had enough evidence to know that what she suspected was not suspicion, but conclusion. She needed one final data point. She needed to know who Raymond Marsh was when the money disappeared, and there was no audience and no performance required. She set the scene over 3 weeks. She withdrew the joint household savings, $11,000, and moved them to a separate account her attorney had helped her establish. She adjusted the shared account balance to show near zero. She prepared the false business account statement on her own equipment, a skill that sat adjacent to her professional work, and that she applied, in this instance, with the same precision she applied to authenticated documents. It showed $62,000 in outstanding business debt, 3 months of missed payments, a notice of default. It looked exactly like ruin. She placed it on the kitchen table on a Thursday evening in November and sat behind it and waited for Raymond to come home. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady. He came in at 6:40, jacket over his arm, already loosened at the collar, and she told him simply and without preamble that she needed him to look at something. She told him about the debt. She told him the savings were gone. She told him the number, $62,000, in the same level voice she used in expert witness testimony. Clear and unhurried, watching his face the way she watched documents for the place where the pressure changed. She watched his face move through 3 stages in approximately 4 seconds. The first was confusion. The second was calculation. The third was something colder and more specific than either, the thing she had been building documentation around for 4 months. He raised his hand and brought it down across her face. She did not flinch back. She did not cry out. The blow landed and she absorbed it with the same quality of stillness she brought to everything, and in the stillness she noted the force of it, the deliberateness of it, the fact that it was not an impulse, but a conclusion, the response of a man who had decided, in those 4 seconds of calculation, that the rules of conduct he performed for an audience did not apply when the audience was gone. She moved with the same deliberate calm that had always defined her. She stood, without hurry, and walked to the hallway and opened the coat closet and retrieved her personal phone from the inner pocket of her winter coat, where it had been recording since 6 o'clock. She checked the recording. The audio was clean. The timestamp was precise. The whole of it, his footsteps in from the garage, his voice moving through the 3 stages, the specific sound of the blow and the silence that followed it, was there, documented, irrefutable, exactly as it had happened. Raymond had not moved from the kitchen doorway. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has acted without thinking and is now beginning to think. She said nothing. She tucked the phone back into her coat pocket and walked past him down the hallway to her office and sat down at the salvage oak drafting table and opened her legal pad to the page where she had been keeping her notes for 4 months. She wrote 3 lines. She underlined the date. She closed the pad. Raymond stood in the doorway of the office for a moment. She did not look up. Eventually his footsteps moved away down the hall, and she heard the television come on in the other room, and she sat at the table her grandfather's tools could have built, and she was very still and very complete. She did not speak to him again that evening. Her face remained perfectly calm. She opened the lockbox the following morning after Raymond had left for work and removed the documentation she had been building for 4 months. It was organized in the way she organized everything. Indexed, cross-referenced, sourced, the Friday evening cash withdrawals, 27 of them over 14 months, totaling $9,400. The business card with Raymond's handwriting. Hotel receipts from a Marriott property in Sandy Springs that appeared on his personal card statement, a statement she had accessed through their joint tax filing, which her accountant had flagged for her 2 years prior when the business deductions seemed inconsistent with his stated income. 6 months of those receipts. The woman's name on 3 of the electronic folios, entered at check-in as a secondary guest. She had known. She had needed the last piece. She picked up her phone and called 2 people. The first was her attorney. The second was her father. Leonard Marsh arrived at her house in Roswell 40, 5 minutes after she called him, in the unhurried way of a man who had learned that arriving quickly was less important than arriving prepared. He was 73 years old and moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had spent a career making sure that nothing he did in an evidence room was wasted. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and looked at the documentation she had laid out, each item in the order she had assembled it, sourced and indexed, and he did not speak for a long while. Then he said, "You built this the right way. I built it the way you taught me." He looked at the recording notation on the phone log. He looked at it for a specific, careful moment. Does he know about the recorder? He knows nothing about the recorder. Leonard nodded slowly. He was quiet again for a moment, the way he had always been quiet when he was measuring the weight of something before he spoke. "Are you hurt?" "I am not hurt," she said. I was not surprised. He looked at her with the particular expression she had seen on his face her entire life. Not pride exactly, because pride implied he had not expected it, and he had always expected exactly this from her. It was something closer to recognition. The look a teacher gives when the student has finally exceeded the lesson. Your grandmother used to say, he began, and she finished it with him. Because she had heard it enough times to carry it without the prompt. You don't have to chase what you've already caught. You just have to close your hand. Her attorney, a woman named Roxanne Peoples, who had practiced family law in Atlanta for 24 years and who wore reading glasses she did not need for reading because they helped her think, arrived at the house 2 hours after Leonard. She reviewed the documentation in the same systematic order Vivian had organized it and made 7 specific notes on her legal pad and asked 3 questions, all of which Vivian answered with source documentation already pulled and ready. When Roxanne reached the recording, she set her pen down. "Georgia is a one-party consent state," Vivian said, before Roxanne could ask. Roxanne looked at her over the reading glasses. "How long have you been planning this?" 4 months of formal documentation. 2 years of observation before that. Roxanne wrote something on the legal pad. The business card. The handwriting, you can authenticate it formally, as an expert, in my sleep. I am going to need a formal authentication report for the filing. It is already drafted. It is in the back of the folder behind the hotel receipts. Roxanne turned to the back of the folder. She found the report. She read the first page, and then read it again. She set the folder down and looked at Vivian across the kitchen table for a long and particular moment, the kind that does not require filling. Then she said, evenly and without flattery, "I have practiced family law for 24 years. I have never had a client hand me a case this complete before I had finished my first cup of coffee." Vivian poured her a fresh cup and said, simply, "My father taught me that preparation is the only part of the process you fully control. The rest," he used to say, "is just reading what was already written." In the 2 weeks that followed, Vivian went to work each morning and came home each evening and moved through the house with the same quietness Raymond had always interpreted as deference and had never understood was simply economy. She wasted nothing, including attention. And Raymond had never been worth the full measure of it. She cooked dinner on the nights she cooked dinner and ordered from the Thai place on the nights she did not, and went to bed at the hour she always went to bed. She asked Raymond about his week with the same cadence she had always used, and listened to his answers with what appeared, from the outside, to be the ordinary attention of a wife at the end of an ordinary day. She passed him the salt before he asked for it. She folded his section of the newspaper and left it beside his coffee the way she had always done. Raymond watched her from across the table and across the room with the watchfulness of a man who suspected something had shifted and could not identify the exact location of the shift. He was waiting for her to surface the incident in the kitchen, to cry or accuse or demand an accounting. She did none of these things. She had already had the accounting. She had already built the ledger. She was simply allowing him the comfort of believing the ledger did not exist. He did not apologize. She had not expected him to. A man who does not apologize when he believes he is being watched does not apologize when he believes he is not. She was not fully present in that house anymore. She was simply completing the record. Roxanne filed on a Thursday morning, which was Vivian's preference, because Thursday gave the week enough momentum that there was no pause before it. No weekend for Raymond to gather himself and call his cousin, who knew a lawyer. The filing included the full asset accounting, both the joint accounts and the separate financial structure Vivian had maintained throughout the marriage, which had been disclosed in a signed acknowledgement Raymond had not read at the time of their refinancing 3 years prior. It included the hotel receipts and the authentication report on the handwritten note. It included the recording. Raymond's attorney called Roxanne on a Friday afternoon and used words like overreach and bad faith, and Roxanne listened to the full message and then drafted a 4-page response that contained, among other things, a still image from the audio recording's metadata that placed the device in the kitchen of the marital home during the incident, and a formal tender of the authentication report to the court as Exhibit A. The counterclaims evaporated in 8 days. The settlement conference was held in Roxanne's offices in Midtown on a Tuesday in February. At a conference table Vivian had sat at once before for a different client matter, which was its own small symmetry. Raymond came in with his attorney and a posture that had deflated considerably from the man who had stood in the kitchen doorway watching her retrieve a phone from a coat pocket 2 months prior. Vivian was already seated. Her father sat to her left, because she had asked him to be there, and Roxanne had agreed it was appropriate, and Raymond's attorney had not objected, because objecting would have cost time and credibility he no longer had in surplus. Roxanne placed the settlement terms on the table. The marital home, titled to Vivian. The full balance of the joint accounts returned. Raymond's personal savings account, the one he had maintained separately, drawing from the Friday cash withdrawals, identified, documented, and included in the asset calculation, bringing the figure to $61,400 that would transfer to Vivian within 30 days of signing. Almost exactly the fictional debt she had invented. Raymond looked at the number for a long moment. His attorney said something quiet in his ear. Raymond looked at Vivian. He had the expression of a man who has spent considerable time and energy on a performance and has arrived at the moment of understanding that the audience knew it was a performance from the beginning. He said, low and deliberate, "You planned all of this." She looked back at him with the full, unhurried attention she had been conserving for 6 years. "I documented all of this," she said. "That is a different thing. Planning requires uncertainty. Documentation requires only patience and a clear eye." She paused for exactly 1 beat. "You raised your hand in my house, Raymond. Everything after that was already written." She did not look at him when he signed. She was looking at the window, at the winter light over Midtown, thinking about the drafting table she would refinish in the spring when the weather allowed it, thinking about the salvage oak and the hairpin legs and the false bottom that had held everything she needed for exactly as long as she needed it to hold. She walked out of Roxanne's offices at 11:40 in the morning on a Tuesday in February, and Leonard held the door, and the air outside was cold and clean, and she did not look back. 11 months passed. The house in Decatur was quieter now, and better for it. She had repainted the kitchen herself in a pale linen color that caught the morning light differently than the gray Raymond had chosen, and she had planted a row of ornamental grasses along the back fence line that moved in the evening wind with a restlessness she found satisfying to watch from the kitchen window while the coffee brewed. Her practice had expanded in the months following the settlement. 2 new law firm contracts, a referral from the federal agency she could not name publicly, and a speaking engagement at a document examination conference in Savannah that had produced 3 additional client inquiries. She had hired a junior examiner named Bria, 28 years old, meticulous and unhurried, who reminded Vivian of no one so much as herself at that age, which was recommendation enough. She heard about Raymond through his own cousin, who had the particular uncomfortable honesty of a family member who has watched someone they love behave in ways that made continued loyalty difficult. Raymond's lease on the Tahoe had not been renewed. Beshvak's sales territory had been reassigned after a compliance review at his firm flagged the inconsistent expense reporting, a review that had been triggered by a document submitted to their HR department by an anonymous source Vivian knew nothing about and would not have acknowledged if she had. Tanya Birch had transferred to a company office in Dallas in March, and the apartment they had shared briefly in Sandy Springs had been vacated by the end of April. She did not feel the shape of this information the way she might have expected. It was simply information. It was simply the ledger closing. A man named Daniel Osai, a restoration architect she had met through her father's former partner at the GBI, had been joining her on Sunday afternoons at the farmers market on the square in Decatur. A habit that had begun as accidental and had become, over the course of 4 months, deliberate in the way that worthwhile things become deliberate. He was a quiet man who noticed the edges of rooms and asked questions that had not been asked before, and listened to the answers with his whole attention. He had seen the salvage oak drafting table on his second visit to the house, and spent 12 minutes examining the joinery without saying a word, and when he finally looked up he said only, "You cut these yourself?" Not a question. An observation. She had said yes. He had nodded and moved on, and that had been its own kind of language. On a Saturday in October, Vivian sat at the drafting table in the morning before the house woke and opened her legal pad to a fresh page and held her pen above it and thought, without urgency, about the next thing she would build. The morning light came in through the east windows and landed across the reclaimed oak surface exactly as it always had. Steady, unhurried, finding the grain of the wood and following it to where it was truest. Authenticity never is in a hurry. The difference is always in where the pen slows down. She was free. She was clear. She was exactly herself. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.